Okay, so moving on to part two of chapter 11, we're going to be talking about the spinal cord next. Okay, so in our skeletal system chapter, we talked about the skull and how the brainstem exits from the foramen magnum. So as it transitions from the brainstem to the spinal cord, it starts all the way up top and runs all the way down to about the first or second lumbar vertebrae. So it doesn't go quite all the way down to the end of our spine. What does go a little bit lower is what is known as the cauda equina, which means horse's tail. And it's kind of a bundle of nerve roots that go just a little bit farther down, and that forms the end of our cord. So they talk about the spinal nerves in groups, kind of like we do the vertebrae. So our cervical spinal nerves, those go to our chest, the head, neck, shoulders, arms, hands, and our diaphragm. So a lot of our upper body stuff, our breathing is controlled by the cervical plexus. And so we'll talk about this again, but the word plexus is a grouping of nerves. So we talk about these groups as the cervical plexus is the cervical spinal nerves. So our thoracic ones innervate our kind of our abdominals and rib cage. So our abs are intercostals, some of our back muscles that run directly with them. And then our lumbar and sacral plexus both do the lower abdomen, our genital region, the upper legs, buttocks, thighs, all the way down to the feet. Okay, so this is kind of a top-down view. So this is a slice in a sense. So this is posterior, that's your spinous process. Here's your vertebral body. Here's your actual spinal cord. So this is a transverse process underneath on either side. And so the spinal nerves kind of run between each individual transverse process or between a couple of transverse processes. So if you think of these sections stacked on top of each other, this spinal nerve is going to kind of exit between the space in between each transverse process. So to walk you through some of this a little bit, so white matter and gray matter we'll talk about first. So white matter is white because it has myelin. So it's got a lot of the axons. So it appears white because of that myelin sheath that covers our axons. And so that's all of our axons or tracks that are running down to supply information. The gray matter does not have myelin because it's mostly cell bodies of our motor neurons. And then there's some interneurons in there too, which are not myelinated. So we also have within this kind of gray matter space a posterior horn and an anterior horn. So we'll talk about those on the next slide. And then our epidural space that just has some fatty tissue for protection. Then our central canal here carries cerebrospinal fluid throughout the whole spinal cord. That runs throughout the whole spinal cord. Okay, like I said, the spinal nerves exit through gaps in the vertebrae that are formed by the transverse processes. And so but before they actually attach all the way, they're considered, or the nerves have two roots before they meet to form a nerve. So you have your posterior or dorsal root, that's going to have your sensory information. And with the posterior root, we talk about the term ganglion, and that just is a cluster of cell bodies. So that formation is just associated with our posterior nerve root. So remember, the most important part of that is to remember that the dorsal or posterior is our sensory information. The ventral or anterior nerve is then motor information. So once these two nerve roots meet, it's known as our spinal nerve. And so that's a single nerve which can carry both parts of the information. So it's a mixed nerve once those roots meet. Okay, our meninges, these are kind of a protective covering, you can think of it as, and there's a few layers to it. So the innermost layer that is on the surface of the brain and spinal cord is known as the pia mater. It has our blood vessels. It's super, super delicate. It's kind of like a just a really, really, really thin covering. And then we have the subarachnoid space that's above the pia mater, but below the arachnoid mater. And this is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So the next we have our arachnoid mater layer, and that's another delicate layer. So that's our middle layer. And then the dura mater is our tough outer layer. And so that's really where we get a majority of our protection. Okay, now we're going to discuss spinal tracts. So a tract is really another term for a grouping of axons. So it's kind of a group of nerves that are all carrying similar information. So we break these into ascending and descending pathways. So the ascending pathways are the ones that are going from our peripheral system up to the brain, are going to carry sensory signals. The descending pathways are going to be the ones that are conducting our motor impulses. So when our brain tells our muscles to do something, it's a descending tract that carries that information. So within the ascending and descending, there's some further breakdown based on what type of information is carried. So the dorsal column does deep pressure and vibration and proprioception, which is basically knowing where your body is in space. So anything related to deep pressure, vibration, or proprioception travels up to the brain via the dorsal column tract. We also have our spinocerebellar tract that is responsible primarily for proprioception, and that actually goes to your cerebellum, which is a part of your brain, and we'll talk about its role later on. So again, that's ascending. It's going from the peripheral system up to the brain. And then the last ascending tract we're going to talk about is the spinothalamic tract. And it is going to relay temperature, pressure, pain, and touch. And so don't worry too much about memorizing exactly which tract carries what, but I do want you to definitely know that these three are all ascending tracts. Okay, on the descending side, we have our corticospinal tract. This is our main one, and it's also known as the pyramidal tract. And so that's what's responsible for pretty much all our movement. And one interesting thing to think here is that it actually is responsible for the opposite side. So our right corticospinal tract is going to have be carrying all the signals for the left side of our body. And then we have the extrapyramidal tracts. And so those are associated with balance and muscle tone. So this is a little bit more of some of our unconscious movements and muscle tone that we maintain is going to be the extrapyramidal tract. So make sure we know that the corticospinal tract is known as the pyramidal tract. That's our main kind of descending system. And the extrapyramidal is also a descending tract. Okay, spinal nerves. So remember we talked about muscle cells and muscle fibers being grouped up into fascicles. So nerves are similar to that as well. So we discussed the structure of a nerve on a very small scale in terms of the cell body and dendrites and axons. So if you see the zoomed in version, there's your axon and your myelin sheath, but they're actually all bundled together with connective tissue and known as a fascicle. So we really kind of a nerve is really a group of axons rather than one individual axon. There's also blood vessels that run within these fascicles. Okay, like I said earlier, you see the groups of spinal nerves are called plexus, are known as a plexus. So our cervical plexus, that supplies our head, that supplies the diaphragm, our arms, shoulders, all that stuff. Brachial plexus is what also supplies down to our arms and hands. Our lumbar plexus and our sacral plexus supplies a lot of our buttocks, genital region, upper thighs, all the way down through to our toes. So there's 8 cervical spinal nerves, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. You do not need to memorize these numbers. What I mainly want you to know from this is that each plexus is the 4 kind of major groupings of nerves. Okay, this is another nice to know, not really need to know slide. So this map is known as a dermatome map. And so basically each nerve has a different part of the body that it innervates in terms of sensation. So this is the map that correlates. So your C2 nerve is what senses your kind of neck and under here. Your T4 level is what goes across your nipple line. And kind of each nerve has its own map. So clinically, this can be very helpful for trying to kind of figure out if there was a spinal cord injury or nerve injury, what levels are affected in terms of where they can feel versus where they can't feel. And there's also something known as myotomes, which is a similar map, but it's for muscles instead of sensation. So all you guys need to know about dermatomes is that each nerve has its own region of the body that it innervates, and that's known as a dermatome, but you do not need to memorize kind of exactly where everything is by any means. Okay, getting into our peripheral nervous system again, we're going to talk about the sensation versus motor stuff, and we're going to talk about that with reflexes. And I think actually I'm going to go ahead and pause it for now and pick back up with, no, let's keep going. There's only a few slides before. We'll take a pause after this. Okay, so let's talk about reflexes. So we talked about reflexes in 2 different ways. You can have autonomic or a visceral reflex, kind of an inherent reflex. And so that's going to be secretion of a gland or contraction of smooth muscle, neither of which we really consciously control. So the example the book uses is the dilation of your pupil. So that's an automatic reflex controlled by our autonomic nervous system. So somatic reflexes are a little bit different. And so they involve both a sensory and a motor nerve. And kind of what happens is that the skeletal muscle ends up contracting after being stimulated by the motor nerve. And a lot of times these reflexes are present so that we are protected and we don't harm ourselves. So an example of this is when we say we touch a hot stove and pull back. So the burn or the heat from the stove is the stimulus that results in the muscle, or the heat and the burn causes our arm or muscle to pull our hand back. So this example is the setup for like when the doctor checks your knee reflex. So you see the doctor hits your patellar tendon with a hammer. So you have receptors located within that tendon that detect the sensation, kind of mimics a stretch. So what happens is that sensation or that the signal from the tendon is sent up through a sensory or afferent neuron back to our posterior horn. It then communicates with the anterior horn, and we get a signal to the quad to kick out straight. So because these nerves are so close together, this is almost an automatic reaction. There's really no lag time. There's not a thought process that is really involved in it. It just happens. Okay, review question here. So bundles of axons within the white matter that serve as routes of communication to and from the brain are called A, ganglions, B, fascicles, C, tracts, or D, plexuses. So we were just talking about these not too long ago, so take a look back if you need to. The correct answer is C, tracts. So remember, ganglions are cell bodies. We think of that with the posterior or dorsal horn. Fascicles are the bundles of our nerve fibers, so that's our bundles of axons. And the plexuses are our larger nerve networks. So remember, we have our cervical, brachial, lumbar, and sacral. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and cut off this part before we move back over to the brain.